Well, good morning. And we're still in the book of Ezekiel. We're this morning in chapter 27. Going to read the first 9 verses. And we're in part of a trilogy of chapters, 26, 27, 28, that all deal with the fall of Tyre. And 26, we saw the ruin of Tyre and the judgment on the city. And in 27, we're going to be looking at the renown of Tyre, and we're going to be really listening to a funeral dirge for the destruction of the city of Tyre. And then chapter 28, we're going to be looking at the rulers of Tyre, which is going to be a very, very interesting chapter, because we're going to see the power behind the throne in that chapter is none other than Satan himself. So that will be an interesting study for sure. But this chapter is also very fascinating. And so it would be the topic, Renown of Tyre. It's kind of the fame and fall of the city of Tyre. And it's really a Titanic story before the Titanic. It's done in such a way that it describes Tyre as a ship, and a beautiful ship, and exquisite ship in every way. And then it talks about the sinking of the good ship Tyre. And so it's done in a way that would, of course, speak to this very much maritime nation. And so that's kind of the background of it. Now, as we think of the key words, we always like to think of those as we look at each chapter. And one of the key words in this chapter is the word merchant, or merchandise, or merchants. And you'll see 21 times in this chapter that word merchant or its derivatives is used. And so clearly, Tyre was, in a sense, the mercantile city of the ancient world. And so therefore its fall was pretty dramatic for the economy of the ancient world alone. It was a dramatic event. And I suppose it would be like the collapse of the North American continent. It would have an effect on the trade all over the globe. And so this is exactly what is going on here. And so this kind of dirge, and it really is a funeral dirge. It's this lamentation. It's really gives a description of the beauty and glory of Tyre. She's likened to a magnificent ship. And also, there's a lot of emphasis on the pride of the people of Tyre, how they displayed their wealth by building their ships. The way that everybody knew Tyre was the place is their ships gave the game away. They were beautifully built ships, beautifully displayed, and so it was kind of the way that they showed their wealth. And so, of course, this is why he uses this illusion. It would speak very definitely to them. And all the very best of materials were used to make this beautiful city. And so basically, that's the picture we're going to see. So as we look at it today, we're going to look at the introduction in verses 1 through 3, and then we'll break into this funeral song. And that will take us all the way down to verse 9. And then there's going to be a little bit of an interlude, prose interlude from verse 10 through 24. And then we'll pick up the funeral song again in verse 25 to the end of the chapter. So pretty straightforward. It was originally written, if you were somebody who knew Hebrew well, it's in a poetic kind of setting, a poetic meter. And so it was clearly meant to be a song. And it's kind of funny. I was thinking, I don't know if you know this song or not, but the funeral song for a sinking of a ship. I remember years ago hearing a song, and it was on the sinking of the ship, the Edmund Fitzgerald. I think it was Gordon Lightfoot wrote this song, and it was all about this ship filled with goods and sinking in the Great Lakes. And so that's kind of the idea. It's this kind of idea of a song about the sinking of a ship, but it's really picturing the lamentation of Tyre's loss of earthly splendor. And as we said, it's all the way through. It's likened to a well-outfitted ship wrongly piloted, and ultimately shipwrecked. And so it's considered to be a classic, by the way, this chapter, by many on the nature, the scope, and the variety of the commerce of the ancient world. And very valuable geographically to list all the cities that they traded with and all the materials that they traded. And so people who study ancient history say that this chapter is one of the most valuable resources of getting a glimpse of just how the ancient world traded, what they traded in, what kind of business. It's remarkable for both geography and nautical awareness. And so it's amazing to think of this prophet of God given such incredible insights. Talk about a man who was clued in to what was going on in the trade and commerce of his world. Ezekiel was. Uh, we don't know how other than we know that God is speaking through this prophet. But certainly there's tremendous knowledge of things nautical and things concerning commerce and trade that are displayed here. And so even secular historians put great value on Ezekiel chapter 27. So here we go. It says, verse 1, the word of the Lord came again unto me, saying, of course, he always starts his messages that way. Again, this is not Ezekiel's opinions. This is the word of the Lord that has come to the prophet. And he says, now thou son of man, take up a lamentation for Tyrus. And now, of course, we saw already that there was a little bit of a lamentation for Tyre in the previous chapter, but now it's kind of fully expanded. And so we saw, for instance, in verse 17 of chapter 26, they shall take up a lamentation for thee and say to thee, how art thou destroyed, that were inhabited of seafaring men. So you had kind of a little introductory lament for the fall of Tyre, but now we have a much fuller description of this funeral lament for Tyre. So the first statement in verse 3 speaks of the situation of Tyre. Say unto Tyrus, O thou that art situate at the entry of the sea, which art a merchant of the people for many isles. Thus saith the Lord God, O Tyrus, thou hast said, I am perfect. I am perfect of perfect beauty. So the first statement is the situation of Tyre at the entry of the sea. And actually, the city had two harbors, one to the north and the other to the south. And it gave tremendous ease of access of the Mediterranean and beyond. And so traders would have no problem bringing trading vessels of any size into their commodious harbors, arriving and leaving port, whatever the sea conditions, was not a problem. And so this is part of their success, is because of the harbors that were there in Tyre, and it gave them this entry to the sea, of course, which is the place of much trade, of course, the Mediterranean Sea and beyond. And so it opened the world to commerce and trade for them. And so there would have been no difficulty for any vessel arriving or leaving from such a port, whatever the sea conditions. The city was partly built on the offshore rocky island, and there was also security from attack as well, because of the way they could come in through behind the island and be safe. And so it was a really prosperous place, glistening on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. It was a proud city. They saw themselves as a city without limits, right? The world was there for them to conquer in terms of their commerce. So their borders in the midst of the sea, and of course, full of beauty. And he talks about this. I am of perfect beauty because of all the wealth that had come to the city as a result of their commercial business. They were able to lavish profits on making the city into a very beautiful place. And they did. And so the builders had perfected the beauty of the city. And so, in a sense, it was a very proud city. Look at what our industry, what our commerce, what our efforts have produced. And so, in a sense, it's showing how prideful they were. And of course, a lot of what we're going to be thinking of in our study of these chapters in 26, 27, 28 is the terrible sin of human pride. And of course, it's something that God hates. And so they claimed that they were beautiful, a beautiful city. And the tragedy is that even though it says, I am perfect of beauty, God has a different opinion of what was a beautiful city. And if you want to just turn with me to the book of Psalms, Psalm 48, he's already, as it were, said what he believes is the beautiful city. In Psalm 48 and verse 2, speaking of Mount Zion, so we're thinking of Jerusalem, verse 2, it says, beautiful for situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. Just turn over to Psalm 50 and verse 2. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God hath shined. And so, what makes Zion beautiful? It was the very presence of God. It wasn't the splendor of its buildings, its architecture, its situation, in the sense. What made it a beautiful city was out of it, the perfection of beauty, God shined forth. Right? The glory of God had been dwelling in the midst of Jerusalem, in the temple there. And so here's a city built by men that is claiming to be the beautiful city. And God is saying, no, there's another city that is beautiful. And of course, that was Mount Zion, where the perfection of beauty shone. And so, again, tragically, this Tyre has really kind of elevated herself as a city of perfect beauty. And we're going to see as we go through this study the range of Tyre's business contacts, their trading. It runs from Greece, Turkey, Armenia in the north, to the Arabian Peninsula in the south, from Persia and Assyria to the east, through the Mediterranean by the way of Egypt, Cyprus, Crete, Tarshish, modern day Gibraltar in the west. In other words, but having done this chapter, you're going to see this why this was so successful was because their trade was so extensive with the known world, and the wealth that flowed into it afforded it the luxury of being able to build all these amazing structures that made it such a city of beauty in man's eyes. So from verse 4 through 7, we're going to look at the ship's construction. And so he's going to describe for us the ship. So he says, thy borders are in the midst of the seas, thy builders have perfected thy beauty. So again, very boastful comments. Thy builders have perfected thy beauty. It's full of pride. In a sense, it reflects what we're going to see in chapter 28, the pride of the ruler of Tyre. In verse 17 of chapter 28, it says, thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. And so, of course, we know we're going to find out that that's the spiritual power behind the success of Tyre was none other than Satan himself. And because he was proud because of his beauty, those that kind of are enslaved to him, deceived by him, follow him, put such an emphasis on external beauty. And so they also, in a sense, their city was a reflection of the power behind the throne, a city built on pride, on self-sufficiency, and also on its kind of view of beauty. It's interesting that when we get to the New Testament, we're reminded of a very self-sufficient church. It's called the Church of Laodicea, and it talks like this: you're rich, and increased with goods and in need of nothing. And there's just a hubris, a pride there, isn't there, in that kind of statement? We don't need anything, even God. We can make this thing work without God. We don't need the breezes of the Holy Spirit. We can have our wind machines and make it work. And so here is a church that is just uh, full of self confidence because of its wealth, and we can make it happen with dollars. That's the idea. And so the builders of the good ship Tyre refer to her rulers, who were the ones who made this. They built the ship. They did it, and of course, nothing for the Lord in all of this. And I think that's what stands out as we go through this chapter. Lots of human achievement, but nothing for God. And that's a tragedy, isn't it? Nothing for God. And he's just not part of it, not part of the thinking. It's all about what human endeavor can do and how we need to avoid that trap. So verse 5, he says, they have made all thy shipboards of fir trees of Senir. They have taken cedars from Lebanon to make masts for thee. So again, he's now going to describe Tyre like a ship. So her planking on the deck of the ship were made from fir trees from Senir. Now, where is Senir? It's actually another name for Mount Hermon. If you look at the book of Deuteronomy and Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 9, it says, which Hermon the Sidonians called Syrian, and the Amorites call it Shenir, or as we see here, Senir. So this is the area, the region of Mount Hermon, and that's where the cedars came from. The same timber, by the way, was supplied by Hiram, king of Tyre, in preparation for the building of the temple. So the same material used for Solomon's temple is being used in the building of their ships. 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 8 through 10. We read about these fir trees. Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I've considered the things which thou sentest to me for, and I will do all thy desire concerning timber of cedar, concerning timber of fir. My servant shall bring them down from Lebanon unto the sea, and I will convey them by sea in floats into the place that thou shalt appoint me. I'll cause them to be discharged there. They shall receive them. They shall accomplish my desire in giving food for my household. So Hiram gave Solomon cedar trees and fir trees according to all his desire. So used for building the house of God, used for building his own house as well. So it was also used for the floor of the temple, this fir. So chapter 6, verse 15, he built the walls of the house within with boards of cedar, both the floor of the house and the walls of the ceiling. He covered them on the inside with wood and covered the floor of the house with planks of fir. So again, just the idea that these fir trees that are used in their ships just for the decking on the ship are the same ones that are used in the house of God. But instead, these are used for man's glorification in the building of the good ship Tyre. Now, her masts, now he moves on and describes her masts. And he says, they've taken cedars from Lebanon, again in verse 5, to make masts for thee. And of course, the cedars of Lebanon, they could reach amazing heights of 290 foot or 88 meters. They provided appropriate raw material for the masts of the good ship Tyre. And as we saw, also cedar was used extensively in the temple as well, as we saw in those previous readings. Or oars of the ship, he says in verse 6, of the oaks of Bashan have they made thine oars. The company of the Asherites have made thy benches of ivory. are brought out of the Isles of Chittim. So first of all, the oars of the oaks of Bashan have they made thine oars. Now Bashan was the east of the Sea of Galilee, and it was renowned for its oak forests. Interestingly enough, both the term cedars of Lebanon and oaks of Bashan are used as symbols of human pride in the scripture, and they're actually used together in the same verses. So I just want you to just take a minute to look with me at the book of Isaiah and chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 12 and 13. It says, "For the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon every man or every one that is proud and lofty, and upon every one that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low, and upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan." So it's amazing how God uses this symbol of pride, of somebody who's been lifted up with arrogance. He uses the term cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan, and how appropriate that the good ship Tyre was using those very materials, because again, it's symbolic of the pride of the whole thing. And so here's a ship. It has these oars for rowing made of these oaks. And then the deck, not only was it made of the fir, but also kind of the various furniture of it seems to be made of ivory. And so he says, again in verse 6, they made your oars, the company of the Asherites have made thy benches of ivory brought out of the Isles of Chittim. So just even the furniture, like the benches that the rowers would sit on, were made of ivory. And we do know, according to one scholar, the use of ivory for ships and homes was developed to a high degree in the city of Tyre. Interesting that King Ahab, remember, he had an ivory palace. In fact, if we look at 1 Kings chapter 22, 1 Kings 22 and verse 39, excuse me, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Ahab and all that he did, and the ivory house which he made, and all the cities that he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel?" Of course, we know that he was closely related to Jezebel, who was from Sidon, which is right next to Tyre, and so perhaps influenced the decor of the house of King Ahab. And so again, Tyre, again, displaying its wealth, using ivory to display its wealth. Just the very benches that the rowers sat upon on the ship were made out of ivory. And so we see something of it. Of course, the Isle of Chittim mentioned here. He says the brought out of the Isles of Chittim. And so Chittim stands for the islands and coasts whose fleet in coming to the east made their rendezvous in Cyprus. And so it would be Cyprus was a port which brought things in from other places, and then from there they were brought directly to Tyre. And so Cyprus is the connection here. What about her sails? How did the ship look? Well, look at verse 7. "Fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was that which thou spreadest forth to be thy sail. Blue and purple from the isles of Elisha was that which covered thee." So again, fine linen with broidered work from Egypt, because Egypt was famous for its linen. And of course, to us, it might seem extravagant to use linen on a ship, but almost not just extravagant, but seemingly insufficient, because you wouldn't think it would be the most strongest material. However, we again read from various historians that ships of antiquity were often fitted out this way so that they could embroider colors on the linen to make it look very, very as it were, attractive. And so that's exactly what's going on here. Elisha is thought by some to be on the east coast of Cyprus, a place called Enkomi. And so that's where some of this blue and purple came to decorate the ships. So you just get the picture. You just laying a picture here of just how extravagant the good ship Tyre was, the extent of the decor. So the next thing we want to learn about is the ship's crew. So what was their crew like? So it says the inhabitants of Zidon in verse 8 and Arvad were thy mariners, thy wise men, O Tyrus, that were in thee were thy pilots. So inhabitants of Zidon that lay north of Tyre, they're often associated together. The Lord talks about Tyre and Sidon. And so, and of course, Tyre was the oldest city of Phoenicia, but not necessarily the most successful, because Tyre took that, as it were, the accolade from them. But Genesis 10 and verse 15, the table of the nations, we read about Canaan begat Sidon. This is chapter 10, verse 15, his firstborn, and Heth. And so it seems like Sidon was built by one of the descendants of Canaan. So certainly an old city in Phoenicia. By the way, there was a large number of oarsmen that were required to operate the merchant ships of the Mediterranean. According to a relief found by Sennacherib, this Phoenician boats were basically had two sets of oars that were used. There was one a lower deck, which was kind of underneath, and they would have oars coming out from there, and then you'd have them on the top deck, and with longer reaches that would row. So you'd have basically two lines of oarsmen, one below, one above, and that's how they would be portrayed and how they would be seen, like a double decker in terms of the oarsmen involved in it. This invisible row applied the water from holes in the ship's hull, and then the other one from the deck. A large Phoenician ship would have as many as 50 oarsmen in a crew of 200 men. So again, you can just imagine this is quite the picture here. And of course, in a city like this, a lot of people were employed. And so again, lots of oarsmen, the crew. Her pilots, however, that wasn't left to foreigners. The crew, yeah, you could have people from Sidon and other nationalities, but the overall control and direction of the good ship Tyre was determined by Tyrians themselves. And so he insists and tells us that her pilots were the wise men of Tyre. They were the ones who were responsible for piloting the good ship Tyre. And then you had caulkers on these ships in verse 9. The ancients of Gibal and the wise men thereof were in thee, thy caulkers. All the ships of the sea with their mariners were in thee to occupy thy merchandise. So the ones responsible for repairing any leaks and cracks in the seams of the boat. We'd call them perhaps shipwrights today. They were from Gibal, which was the Greek Byblos, north of Beirut, and its inhabitants are called Giblites, and they had the responsibility of repairing the vessel. They pitched hemp into the seams to prevent the water from oozing through. Very important responsibility. And then, of course, her customers, he says again in verse 9, all the ships of the sea with their mariners were in thee to occupy thy merchandise. So she had customers, all the ships of the sea and their mariners were involved in trade with Tyre. Not one land that carried on commercial and maritime activity failed to deal with Tyre. Of course, on these ships, you also had Marines. what we'd call the military wing that would be there to defend the ship from pirates and such like. And so he says in verse 10, they of Persia and of Lud and of Put were in thine army, thy men of war. They hanged the shield and helmet in thee. They set forth thy comeliness. And so, by the way, this is the first mention of Persia in the Old Testament. Going to be kind of a significant player, especially in the history of the reconstruction of the temple. Cyrus the Persian, but this is the first mention of Persia in the scriptures. And so, as they think of the various soldiers, and they were mercenaries that were employed by Tyre to defend their ships, to fight for them. And they're from Persia, from Lud, which is Lydia in Asia Minor, and Put is modern day Libya. And so they hired fighting men from these places. And not only were they fighting men, but they also used, when they were not involved in conflict, they would hang their shields on the side of the ships. And again, to, as it were, beautify and to give a big picture. So the combination of it all was kind of overwhelming. The city kingdom of Tyre, like a mighty, beautiful, well-run ship, quite magnificent, and yet tragically, it makes the disaster of the sinking of the ship even more dramatic. We're going to see that it's going to get broken up in verse 26, that thy rowers have brought thee into great waters, the east wind hath broken thee in the midst of the sea. And so it's one day it's going to be all destroyed, but at this present time, we're getting a view of how magnificent it was compared to this goodly ship about to experience a great shipwreck. Of course, the shields hanging added to the beauty, just like the old Viking ships, often would be adorned in this way with shields down the sides. And so these marine mercenaries, these fighting men, these individuals, again, verse 11, the men of Arvad with thine army were upon thy walls round about, and the Gammadims were in thy towers. They hanged their shields upon thy walls round about. They have made thy beauty perfect. So again, we got these different mercenaries. The word Gammadims, that just literally means fighting men. These mercenaries, the valorous men. That's the meaning of the name, perhaps from northern Syria. And so warriors, and of course the ship decorated with all of their shields. And again, we get another reference to this idea of it all bringing a composite picture that is described as perfect beauty. And so they have made thy beauty perfect. And so Tyre used many sources to enhance her beauty, to fortify her city, to spread her influence, much like the nations today, doing all this with little thought for God. Thus their doom is sure, they only are awaiting God's hour. And again, it just shows that all of this, and really it goes back to Babel, doesn't it? If you think back to Babel, it was what man can achieve without God. We're going to build a tower to heaven. We don't need God's help. And so it's this kind of mentality that will ultimately be seen in commercial Babylon in the last days. So beginning in verse 12, we're now going to be thinking down to verse 25 about the ship's cargo. So we've talked about the ship's material, how it's built. We talked about how it's defended, its mercenaries, and we talked about its pilots, its oarsmen, and really now we want to think about the cargo. So we're kind of moving away from the idea of nautical terms to more the world of merchants and merchandise. And so it's all to do with who they were trading with. We're going to think about fairs. We're going to think about lots of commercial activity that Tyre dealt with. And so clearly we're going to see the immense influence as the center of Middle East trade and beyond. And some commentators call this section the trade directory. It's a list of cities who traded with Tyre and the goods that they traded. So we begin in verse 12 with Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kind of riches, with silver, iron, tin, and lead, they traded in thy fairs. So the distant city of Tarshish, likely in the southern Spain, also was Jonah's intended destination when he was meant to go to Nineveh. He took a ship to Tarshish, and so again on the southern coast of Spain, it was a trading partner with Tyre, was Tarshish. In fact, Tyre sold them luxury goods. They brought silver, iron, tin, lead from them. Perhaps some of the tin would have come from Britain. Great Britain, of course, is the name is connected with tin because it was the tin mines of Cornwall on the west. And so basically they would have traded with Tarshish, and then Tarshish would have brought the tin with them to the city of Tyre. And so this trade directory, they're bringing these things. Notice, let's go to look at 1 Kings 10 for a moment. 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 22. It says, for the king had at sea a navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver and ivory and apes and peacocks. So obviously a lot of trade connected. This is in Solomon's reign between Tarshish and Hiram of Tyre. And so again, you get a sense that a lot of wealthy goods, all various riches, were brought from Tarshish to the city of Tyre to be sold in their fairs or traded in their fairs. Verse 13, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, they were thy merchants. They traded the persons of men and vessels of brass in thy market. So tragically, part of what was also being sold in the markets of Tyre was slaves. There was a healthy slave trade that was taking place. Human trafficking, slave traders are not a new thing, but was very much again a commercial thing. And what we could say is this: that one of the things we learn about commerce is that it can be very, very heartless. Because it's godless, it's also heartless. So anything that can turn a profit is worth pursuing, and including slavery. And so we can see how these kind of industries develop because again, once you take God out of the picture, people have no conscience about their activities. And so we certainly see that these nations were involved trading the persons of men and vessels of brass in thy market. And so, again, just a tremendous tragedy. And of course, Javan, Tubal, and Meshach, they're all descendants of Japheth. We know that from Genesis 10. It's kind of, Genesis 10 is such a foundational chapter of laying out the table of the nations. After Babel, when the confusion of the languages and the world was divided into national entities based on linguistic usage. And so we see, for instance, in chapter 10, verse 3, it says, the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Ripther, and Togarmah. And so these, verse 2, you have the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. So again, these that are mentioned right here in these verses, sons of Japheth, Javan, Tubal, and Meshach. And so who are these people that are trading in these goods? Where are they from? Well, Javan is the Ionians or the Greeks. Okay, they're Javan. Tubal and Meshach refer to people who lived between the Black and the Caspian Sea. So in the area that we would know, very familiar with, kind of the Eastern Bloc countries that were part of the former Soviet Union, between the Black and Caspian Seas. So that's where Tubal and Meshach come from. That's going to be significant when we get to Ezekiel chapter 38, because they're going to attack Israel in the last days, people from that very region. But at this point, they're just involved in making money through slave trading and also trading in brass. And so, again, just this is part of their cargo. Now, of course, there was a slavery that existed in ancient Israel, but it had nothing to do with the practice of man stealing, which was human trading that marked the institution of slavery. So what they would do is they would basically just overtake other nations, and they would just get all the strong men and compel them to become slaves. And so it was man stealing, and then it became man dealing, if you like, and putting them in the market, human trading. Israel, they had slaves, but it was always economic. So if you got in debt that you couldn't pay, then you would become a slave to somebody in order to clear your debt. But it was never an issue of, in the nation of Israel, of stealing people, and it was always connected with economic issues. And so, and it was never long term unless they volunteered to become a permanent slave. They were to be released at the year of Jubilee. So there were very humane laws in Israel, but certainly in Tyre, they were happy to deal with this market of slave trading. And they did this as a result of men stealers who would gather these unsuspecting victims and put them into slavery. Treating human beings like property, mere tools for economic profit. And very contrary to God's law, tragically, our own countries are involved in this. The human trafficking is a massive crime that is taking place. And of course, it's fueling the sex industry tremendously. A lot of the human trafficking is connected with that. And again, it's all for profit. People are just usable commodities, and it's a great shame and a reproach on the human race. It really is, but and the sinfulness of the heart of man. And so it seems that Tyre was especially guilty and cold-blooded in this practice. Long before Ezekiel's time, Amos rebuked Tyre for their trafficking of slaves and a violation of the covenant of brotherhood. If you look at Amos chapter 1, book of Amos and chapter 1, you will notice that he mentions this, because this predates Ezekiel. Verse 9 and 10, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyrus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity of Edom, and remembered not the brotherly covenant. But I will send a fire on the wall of Tyrus, which shall devour the palaces thereof." Remembered not the brotherly covenant. And basically what they did was they captured people from Edom and they sold them into slavery. And so certainly they're rebuked for such conduct. Trafficking in slaves. The bodies and souls of men were bought and sold in those days, as sadly in our degenerate age. So not only did Tyre deal in exotic materials and crafts, but also in the trading in the persons of men. And what's interesting is that it's not going to go away. We'd like to think it will, but in the book of Revelation, when we get to the commercial Babylon of the last days, We'll notice in chapter 18, verse 13, it says, and cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. So this idea of human trafficking is not going to be eradicated. And actually, commercial Babylon in the last days, which is going to be trading in various things, will also be trading in slaves and the souls of men. And so it's definitely not going away. So we get to verse 14, and it says, they of the house of Tagarma traded in thy fairs with horses and horsemen and mules. So Tagarma, again, most people believe Tagarma is what we would call today Armenia. The Armenians are people in the Taurus country, noted for horses, mules, according to the historian Xenophon. Strabo also and Herodotus all talked about this region of Taurus, they being traders in horses. So again, there was horse trading taking place as well from Tagarma. Again, Tagarma, that Armenian area, is also going to be involved in a coming invasion of Israel in the last days. We know that from Ezekiel 38 and verse 6. Verse 15, it says, the men of Dedan were thy merchants. Many isles were the merchandise of thine hand. They brought thee for a present horns of ivory and ebony. So the men of Dedan. Now it's interesting that there's a discrepancy between the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and the Masoretic text here in the term Dedan. In the Septuagint, they have roads as opposed to Dedan. Dedan is actually Saudi Arabia, what we now call Saudi Arabia. And the reason that they often would say that it should be Rhodes rather than Dedan is that Dedan is mentioned down in verse 20. And so they say, well, it's repetition. And so it really should be, as the Septuagint says, Rhodes. However, to give the alternative view, which is the view that I would hold, that it should be, as it says, the Masoretic text was correct, that it is Dedan, is when you look at verse 22 and 23, you'll see Sheba is also mentioned twice. The merchants of Sheba and Ramah, they were the merchants, they occupied in thy fairs with chief of all spices, with all precious stones and gold. Haran and Cana and Eden, the merchants of Sheba, Asher, Kilmad, were thy merchants. So the writer has no problem in mentioning Sheba twice. Why should he have a problem mentioning Dedan twice? So Dedan, in my humble opinion, here is Saudi Arabia, and it's mentioned twice. The men of Dedan were thy merchants. Of course, we know that the camel traders came with their merchants from Saudi Arabia. And they brought presents of ivory and ebony. Of course, they would trade that from Africa. Why would they not do that? So no question in my mind that that's what's going on here. Verse 16, it says, Syria was thy merchant. So we're thinking of the area of Damascus. By reason of the multitude of thy wares of thy making, they occupied in thy fairs with emeralds, purple, broidered works, fine linen, coral, and agate. So various beautiful jewels coming from Syria, trading in the markets of Tyre. Verse 17, Judah and the land of Israel, they were thy merchants. They traded in thy market wheat of Minnith and Panag and honey and oil and balm. So even Judah and Israel had become entangled in the materialism and display of Tyre that was bringing wheat from Minnith, and they didn't stay separate. They were involved in this a whole trading business as well. And of course, tragically for them, when they got involved in this trade, they became envious of the wealth of places like Tyre, and they began to export some of their customs, and especially their religious customs, into the nation of Israel. So Minnith was an Amorite town, evidently a wheat growing area. It's mentioned in the book of Judges in chapter 11. And we'll just take a look there. Judges 11 and verse 33. And so it says, and smote them from Aror, even till thou come to Minnith, even 20 cities, and unto the plain of the vineyards, with a very great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. So this is Jephthah fighting, and so clearly a wheat growing area. Now, he also mentions here, again in verse 17, Panag. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Panag, from what I'm given to understand, is not a place, but a sweet meat made from honey. So it'd be kind of a dessert made from honey, like baklava, that kind of idea. So that was traded as well. Judah traded in that, as well as honey and oil and balm. And so they were very active in trading as well. And then Damascus. Once again, we're back in the area that we call today Syria. Was thy merchant in the multitude of the wares of thy making, the multitude of all riches, in the wine of Helbon and white wool. So there, again, their trading. Chief export of Damascus was wine. Helbon, which is modern day Aleppo, we hear that on the news, was a vine growing region northeast of Damascus, brought to the city of Damascus, then purchased there, and then found its way into the markets of Tyre. And so also white wool. And so Dan, in verse 19, also in Javan, going to and fro, occupied in thy fairs, bright iron, cassia, calamus were in thy market. Now, the Hebrew text here reads Vidan. Some believe this is a reference to Aden. Javan, again, is Greek, probably a Greek colony in Arabia. It's been suggested the colony is Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and they did cassia, calamus. These were ingredients that were involved in the holy anointing oil. And Dedan was thy merchant in precious clothes for chariots, or riding clothes, luxury clothing items. Just amazing. All the, I mean, this hard to bring practical application out of this, but what we can see is that it's clearly great commercialism connected with the city. Now we don't have time. Believe it or not, our hour has just disappeared before us, and we have much more ground yet to inherit in chapter 27. But again, what we need to recognize is that there's nothing wrong with merchants, commercialism, when God is part of the picture. The tragedy of the city of Tyre was it was commerce without God and then without conscience. And then it became a problem. And so again, we need to recognize God has to be the center of every activity we're involved with, including our daily business. And if he's not, then it gets out of whack and results in human pride, self-achievement, and ultimately the judgment of God. So may God help us to understand. Next time, Lord willing, we'll look at the sinking of the good ship Tyre.